Emily's eyes looked out of the window onto the front porch of the small, two-story cottage. The yellow light of the bulb sizzled across the rustic floorboards, painting the surrounding walls and porch swing in a golden hue before disappearing into the murky, cold evening air. There was no moon tonight. There were no stars. After the pink clouds had turned purple, as the sun slipped below the horizon, the snowy world surrounding the cozy home had morphed into a thick, black liquid. It melted the view of anything beyond the small set of stairs that led up to its door. The girl shivered and pulled her eyes away, back to the fire that crackled happily beneath the hearth. In 1971, a little over a year ago, when she had crossed the threshold with a box in her arms, Greg had smiled and said, "This is what we've been needing. This is our dream." She had agreed. It was perfect. It was the dreamscape that they had always hoped they would find. A lush 20 acres, covered in spruce and pine that wedged itself between the mountains. A small gravel drive that bumped its way from the road deep into the woods. And finally, the small house with stone walls so strong, but so weathered. They seemed to grow organically from the ground itself. Small, rounded windows peered out across the porch and also down from above, like eyes carved into a stone statue. Vines clung to the walls along the sides, twisting their fingers up to the roof and beyond, dangling like green drapery against the stones. If you made your way down the gravel drive and found yourself at the main road, you would find that the nearest town was exactly 5.5 miles to the east. She liked this at first. It added to the beauty and the mystery of what she now called home. It was a little land far, far away, where make-believe could come true and there was no one near who could argue with it. However, as she sat staring into the fire, her hand on her swollen midsection and another searing pain tearing through her, she thought of those 5.5 miles as one might think of time during a prison sentence. She thought of the stupid, stupid car that sat just a few yards away, which decided to do nothing but sputter, today of all days. She thought of the silly notion she had previously had, that at this point in time, she would be in a clean hospital bed, waiting for the creation of their brand new family. And finally, she thought of Greg, bundled in his parka and fighting the cold and the miles, trying to bring her help. She closed her eyes tight and whispered, "I really, truly hate this," before letting out a howl as another pain ripped through her. She began taking deep breaths, hissing as the air shot between her teeth and tearing at the sides of her chair with her fingers. As the pain eased and calm began to return, a loud crack echoed through the darkness beyond the windows, on the opposite side of the room. She jumped and then sat silently for a moment, listening, hoping it might be Greg. She knew it was unlikely, though. He had only been gone for around an hour. The porch creaked and groaned loudly just outside the window beside her, and she turned her head. Her lungs deflated in a small squeak as she froze. There was someone standing there, just on the other side of the window. Their back was turned to her as they stared out into the snowy dark, swaying back and forth with jagged, rough movements. They were dressed in a white robe, the hood pulled up over their head. The robe was torn and tattered, with twigs and leaves stuck in the loose threads. Deep, red stains were slashed along the fabric, mixed with what looked like human hair. They were holding a cat's carcass by the tail, letting the head bump into the floor each time they swayed, causing a muted, sickening thump that jerked at Emily's bones. There was another loud crack from the other side of the house, causing her head to jerk back toward the other windows. A loud groan echoed through the house as the lights flickered and then left her all alone in the dark, the only light from the small fire that was quickly turning to embers. She looked back to the porch and found that the window was now nothing more than a wall of black. Another pain rocked through Emily's body before she could move away from the window. Her eyes winced as she forced herself up from the chair, the increasing pain ripping through her like a knife. She hurriedly pulled at the curtains, fumbling with them momentarily before finally yanking them closed. She backed away and stood shaking in the middle of the living room, the fire crackling behind her, as she tried to decide what to do. A loud whistling erupted from the kitchen, causing her to release a short yelp before slamming her hand over her mouth. Her eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for something to defend herself. She ran to a small basket beside the couch and pulled out a knitting needle, quietly sliding the unfinished small sweater off as she brought it up in front of her. She stood silently for what seemed like hours, waiting for the whistling to end or another noise to follow. The light from the fireplace danced in shadows around the room, bathing her surroundings in a dark red glow. She slowly backed herself toward the hearth, steadying herself against it before finally taking a deep breath. "If there's someone in here, you need to leave now," she yelled, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "I have a gun." She listened intently for another stretch of forever, her ears slowly starting to ring as the whistle continued, seeming even louder now than it had before. Another pain grew inside her, pulling her down into a crouching position as she struggled to keep the knitting needle pointed in front of her. She couldn't keep standing there, just waiting for something to happen. For all she knew, she was overreacting. She had never actually heard anyone break into the house. She took a deep breath, and as the pain subsided, she walked slowly toward the kitchen door. She stayed up on her toes of her feet, trying to avoid the weakest parts of the floor that would give her away. Her hands trembled in front of her, both clinging to the needle that could potentially turn into a weapon. She reached the door to the kitchen and pressed herself against the wall just outside, peeking slowly into the room and holding her breath. The large silver teapot on the stove sang loudly as billows of steam poured violently from the spout. Emily hurried over to the stove and moved the pot off the burner, shaking her head and almost laughing. Her hands continued to tremble as she continued to stare at it in stunned disbelief. Certainly she would have heard if someone had actually come into the house. Had she turned the stove on and forgotten? Had the generator somehow affected the stove? Just as she started to convince herself that all of this was somehow tied to the pains of labor, or a startling coincidence, heavy, stomping footsteps rattled the floorboards behind her. Emily swung around and found the person from the porch standing just a few feet away, blocking her path out of the kitchen and swaying roughly back and forth. A scream tore its way through her throat as she smashed herself back against the stove and held up the knitting needle threateningly. "Who are you?" Emily screamed. "Get out of my house." The person didn't move. They didn't say anything. Emily could tell that it was a woman, if you could call her that. The robe only covered the back half of her, and even though the hood covered her face, the front of her body was entirely bare. Two long, leathery breasts hung down over her protruding, round belly. Her legs were spindly and covered in dark hair, with knobby knees that sank inward, threatening to collapse on each other. The tattoo of a snake swam up the side of her calf and around her thigh, the head disappearing between her legs. Her toenails were broken and bloody, and her feet were caked with mud. She still held firmly to the tail of the dead cat, its entrails scraping along the floor as she swayed. The woman finally moved, causing Emily to jump. She patted firmly on her own belly a few times, causing the skin to ripple and her breasts to shake. She pointed to Emily's stomach, and then tapped her own again before letting out a loud, short laugh. "What do you want?" Emily screamed at her. The woman let out an angry snarl and then punched at her own stomach. A heavy pain tore through Emily's body, this one stronger than the ones before. She fell to her knees for a brief moment, clutching onto the kitchen counter beside her to try and steady herself. She winced and let out a loud moan as her insides twisted and tore, preparing for the birth that was coming swiftly. This seemed to excite the woman, making her hop up and down a few times on her broken feet before taking a few dragging steps toward Emily. "Get the hell away from me," Emily screamed, pulling herself back up off the floor. The woman let out a hoarse and garbled war cry, charging toward her while swinging the cat back and forth. Emily screamed as the woman closed in and shoved the needle in her hand as hard as she could into the woman's stomach. It sent the lady flying back as she tossed the cat into the air and grabbed at her wound. This gave Emily just enough time to run from the room. She stumbled slightly as she willed her terrified legs to move, and finally she made her way to the front door and out into the dark night. Where could she go? She couldn't follow the drive to the road. She'd be out in the open, and the woman could be on top of her at any moment. She had to hide. It was her only option. She ran to the east side of the house, and then further, into the shadowy woods. Another pain knocked her off her feet as she entered the towering trees, sending her flying headfirst into the thickets. Their thorny branches ripped and tore at her nightgown and yanked angrily at her hair as she pulled herself away. She could hear the angry woman screaming again, howling with a broken but fierce voice into the night. Emily knew she had to go deeper. She had to get away. She ran blindly into the snowy night, her feet and body immune to the cold as her heart pumped wildly in her chest. Another pain rocked her to the side, this time sending her foot into a hole. She heard a loud snap and stumbled as a sharp pain went shooting through her ankle and mixed with the pain of her contraction, sending her face first into the snow in front of her. She rolled shakily onto her back and grabbed at her ankle. It was already beginning to swell, and her foot wouldn't move. It would only send signals of fire each time she tried. Tears stung her frozen face as she let herself lie back against the snow and look up into the trees. Everything was quiet and still. There were no noises, except the clinking of the tree branches in the icy breeze. It was so dark. It was the dark that never lets your eyes fully see anything around you. It only toys with you in shapes and moving shadows. However, even in this deep darkness, when her eyes could hardly see her hand in front of her face, there was no mistaking the figure that was teetering on a branch just above her, staring down angrily. Emily screamed and flailed around wildly as the woman jumped from the branch and landed on the ground just a few feet from her. She tried to push herself away, but her feet and hands just slipped around in the melted puddle of snow that surrounded her. The woman skittered toward her on all fours like a spider across a snowy web, and finally pulled herself up over her, their faces just inches from each other. The woman's breath smelled of animal feces and death. Her eyes were gray and empty. She spit into Emily's face and then pulled herself down between her legs. Emily kicked and screamed, throwing her fist down toward her as hard as she could, but the woman just started laughing. She held Emily down with one strong, inhuman hand and pulled the other into the air in a theatrical move before finally ramming it into her stomach. The world tilted and then went dark around Emily as her conscious mind finally fell into a deep, sleepy abyss. As everything slipped away, she heard Greg's distant voice screaming her name over and over before finally sliding into utter silence. She awoke, and the room was warm and bright. There was a quiet, rhythmic beeping beside her, and she found herself wrapped in a blanket and propped up by a pillow. Greg was at the foot of the bed, holding her hand and smiling at her as he leaned in and kissed her on the forehead. "I'm so glad you're awake. You really scared me," Greg said. Emily looked around the room and finally realized that she was in a hospital bed. "How did I get here?" Emily asked. "I brought you straight here when I found you in the woods. Your ankle was broken and you had passed out," he said. and paused for a long moment. "What happened, Emily? You suddenly went running out into the woods and I had to chase you out there," Greg said, his face looking concerned. Emily felt at her stomach, and her heart sank. "What happened to the baby, Greg?" she asked. "Where's my baby?" Greg's concern grew deeper as a confused expression crossed his face, and he shook his head. "What baby, Em?" he asked. "What baby?" Emily screamed. "I was about to have a baby when that woman attacked me. Where's my baby?" She clawed at her stomach as if she could dig her way in and find it, as a nurse entered the room carrying a small syringe. "You couldn't have been pregnant, Em," Greg said. "Don't you remember? You had cancer, and they had to... It's impossible. I'm so sorry, sweetie." Greg brushed his hand through her hair and kissed her forehead again as the nurse stuck the needle into Emily's IV. "Sometimes they can be a bit disoriented when they wake up, especially after all she's been through," the nurse said. A warm sensation brushed its way through Emily's veins, and the world started to go dark again. "I want my baby," she whispered. And then there was nothing.